Noon to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, where we are bringing you our live stream lecture after two really fun and successful live stream Q&As, and after a really fun weekend with all of you, we finish it up with the third part of our live stream lectures. When we started doing live streams in May of last year, we were only doing Saturday afternoons, our Q&A, and then we bumped it up to Sundays for a Q&A, and then eventually we decided to jam the weekend with it. Start your weekend off right with Q&A on Friday, keep it going on Saturday evenings with some more Q&A, ask me anything, and on Sundays the topics that I used to want to talk about in the Q&A that I could never get to because of all the wonderful questions became a live stream lecture topic. And so I will be doing a live stream lecture today about one of my favorite topics that you might have heard of before before today started, and that is the 7 Years' War, what I consider to be the First World War, and the history behind it, what happened, what caused it, how it happened, what were the results, its impact and legacy. And of course, I'm going to describe and give my argument as to why I believe this is the First World War. So if you're here to learn about history, you're in the right place. And join us every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for live streams where I ask and answer where you guys ask and I answer all your questions related to history and social studies. And then keep your weekend going well on Saturdays with another Q&A. And then on Sundays, come and listen to the sound of my voice as I guide you through a historical topic that you may not know about. And if we have some time here at the end of a live stream today, we will be doing some Q&A as well. So if you want to stay on and you have any questions, especially related to the topic about which I'm going to share, you're in the right place, and I'm glad that you are all here. And one thing I'm really loving now is that I can select my background. So before I go any further, a happy Groundhog Day to everybody. Punxsutawney Phil did indeed see his shadow, so 6 more weeks of winter. I believe that's how that technically works. But the historical topic I am going to be sharing with all of you isn't about Groundhog Day, February 2nd, although I do have a video coming out about that and has already launched on my Patreon. So consider joining the Patreon Friendly History, where you get early access to all of my content and to a special series on the First Ladies with our first video on Martha Washington dropping recently. My topic today, however, has nothing to do with that. It doesn't have to do with the First Ladies, Punxsutawney Phil, or the incredible tradition, but actually how this man, George Washington, actually became where he came from and his story in the general stage of history. So George Washington actually enters the stage of history not during the American Revolution, but during the 7 Years' War, which I'm going to be talking about. So if you enjoy history, then you're in the right place. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. Consider liking and subscribing and becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that. And thank you for the wonderful Q&As. And today I will be discussing the 7 Years' War. So in our usual live stream lecture. So the 7 Years' War obviously doesn't last, guess, it lasts 9 years. Yes, 1754 to 1763, because it's called by different names in different places. Now, usually people, when they think of a world war, they think of the First World War as the Great War, the war to end all wars, and it only became the First World War because there was a Second World War. But nobody in 1918 or 19 at least hoped or thought there would be a Second World War, so they just called it the Great War. And the 7 Years' War, which I believe is the real First World War, wasn't called that at all either. It was called the 7 Years' War, and in different places it was called different things. So in America, it was called the French Indian War because that was the American phase of the fighting and the action. And that actually started 2 years before fighting on the European continent began. But basically, let me give you some background for the different phases and areas of where this war took place. First, let's start with America because that's where the war began. For a couple of centuries, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and other groups had tried their absolute best to influence the Native Americans and take over their land, trade with them, and control their areas. And as more and more colonists had come and settled, more and more land had been taken from the natives. This was particularly done along the Atlantic seaboard with the colonies formed by the British. And by the early 1700s, they had established all 13, with Georgia being the final one in 1729, originally scheduled to be a debtor's prison where people who owed debts could go as indentured servants, work off their debt, and then settle and live in that area. True story. Georgia started off as a prison, more or less. The beautiful Georgia on my mind. Anyways, so moving on. After that, so the British had established several colonies that we all know very well that turned into the 13 colonies, which would later turn into the United States. However, the French also had colonies in the New World in what is now the middle of the country, the Midwest. Those lands actually originally belonged to the French. Louisiana was named after King Louis XIII, and when it was, or King Louis XIV, when it was originally founded. So most of the colonies in the middle of the country, south, north, and west, and center, were founded by the French. So the French had colonies, the British had colonies, the Spanish had been there before anyone else. They had already conquered all of Central America, most of South America except for Brazil, and most of the Pacific seaboard. So they had California, the Southwest, Texas, all of this land. And this land went back and forth between the Spanish and the French. And basically, the middlemen for a lot of these relations were the Native Americans. And the Native Americans were usually used to being treated very badly, especially by the British, the colonists, the English colonists, who would continually push them back into Western frontier territories while seizing more and more land for themselves, whether this was in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, or New York. Many of the lands that were considered the frontier were eventually taken from the natives and settled by the colonists. Meanwhile, the Spanish had developed an encomienda system where they enslaved the natives and used them as basically cheap or not, if not free labor, while trying desperately to convert them to Catholicism in order to save their souls and civilize them. The French actually had the best relationship with the Native Americans because they had developed good trading routes with them and had primarily used their relationships with Native Americans in order to trade and not do much else. So, because their relationship was based on trade and some sorts of conversions and civilizing, they really did not enslave or subjugate the Native Americans or establish as strong of a foothold on the land because of this. So you have the good and the bad. The good is that the French are the moral victors here, where they didn't impose their will upon the natives in Canada or in the middle of the United States, forcing them to become basically slaves or killing them off. But the at the same time, they also did not establish as strong of a foothold on the land as the English or the Spanish had done so. So, because of that, the natives had a lot more freedom in French lands in Canada and the center of the United States. So, places like Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, all originally settled by the French. The Ohio River Valley became the most contested area, as did many parts of eastern Canada, as the French and the English established rival colonies. Now, England and France had a centuries long conflict of fighting against each other, and this war would be no exception. And yet the natives had mainly sided with the French because the French had not stolen their land, subjugated, or enslaved them, and they had not forced them to convert. So the natives had a much better opinion of the English than they did the French. The Spanish, despite holding all of this land, were in steady decline as France had become more and more prominently the European powerhouse during the 1600s. By the middle of the 1700s, the English had their formidable navy while also establishing full control over the 13 colonies and continually encroaching westward into lands that were contested between them and the French. So, because of this, the French continually had issues with the land that they owned. Related to the Indians. On the one end, they allowed the Native Americans of the different tribes, such as the Huron in Michigan, to basically do whatever they wanted, while at the same time having less of a foothold on the land that they actually wanted to control. Because they had less of a foothold on the land they wanted to control, they had less influence than the English did. While the English subjugated the natives, they had more established colonies, and the English also had a much better navy at sea. So the fighting in America was based on the fact that the natives saw their land being encroached, went to the French for help, and the English began pushing more and more western, more into the Western territory that was today the Midwest, places like Ohio and Indiana. That was the Western territories back then. And this obviously created a conflict of interest because the land was contested between the natives, the Indians, and the native Indians, the French, and the English. So in the 1750s, the English sent General Bradford into that area to hello, welcome. Thank you for joining. We are in the middle of our live stream lecture. I won't be interacting with the chat as much, but I really appreciate everyone for being here on a Sunday. Welcome to the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, where we are doing a live stream lecture on the First World War. So if you want to learn the actual history of the actual First World War, then you are in the right place. So thank you very much. Please be sure to like and subscribe and all of that great stuff. Anyways, so the English sent forces into the Ohio River Valley, which is now the states of Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, basically trying to make sure they still had that land, the land that they had already claimed there. Bradford and his forces led the British contingent, while the American contingent was led by a young lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington. Bradford was ambushed and murdered, and Washington was actually had to rally the troops around himself and retreat after with a tail between his legs, basically after being demolished by the combined French and Indian forces. And from that point on, just as they had been so far, the French and the Indians remained relatively at peace with one another and worked with one another to fight as much as they possibly could. And this led to them basically declaring war on the English. So the Seven Years' War actually begins 9 years before it ended in 1754 with the American phase of the war known as the French Indian War. And the fighting would take place in Canada and the Midwest of the United States. Again, places like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois. And the American colonists would fight and die for the British, while the British would continually encroach on land that originally belonged to Native Americans. And the French did everything they could to allow their native allies to undermine and ambush and destroy the English and attack their settlers. So there was fighting on the American continent between the Canadians, who were of both English and French background, the Native Americans, and the future and the colonial settlers of the 13 colonies who would later become the United States. So basically, by the way, if you're coming here asking questions and things like that, I'm sorry, but this is a live stream lecture. If I have time at the end, I will take any questions you have related to history and social studies. We do those on Friday and Saturday nights. I know that's what the channel is usually known for, but this is our live stream lecture where I am lecturing about the history of the First World War, the actual First World War that happened not in the 1910s, not the war to end all wars, but the First World War, the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 60s. So there's fighting in America between the British and the French and their different native allies. Now, the British do have native allies, including the Iroquois nation. Now, the Iroquois in northeast, no, in north, in upstate New York had developed a confederacy of 5 different tribes, and all of them did everything they could to help the British during the war. The most famous of these tribes were the Mohawk Indians, who were known for having a certain particular type of hairstyle. That's where the Mohawk comes from. So, anyways, basically, uh, anyways, so as I was saying, um, the British and the French were fighting there and using their different native allies to their advantages. And the Mohawk natives, with their particular hairstyle, were one of 5 Iroquois Nation tribes. They actually formed a little bit of a republic, who did everything they could to help the British in the Western territories of New York, Ohio, and places like that. So the British and the French were fighting there. So the war has already started 2 years before the actual date. Sound familiar? Because that happens in World War II and World War III a lot. But back to World War One. In Europe, there is continual tension between other countries. So England and France are already at war, and this is something that's very common. The Portuguese are helping the English because the Portuguese and the English have been allies for 4 centuries at this point, in the longest lasting alliance in world history, the eternal alliance as it is known between the Portuguese and the English. At the same time, the Spanish usually help the French in matters like this, but they are in decline and are not going to be a major part of this war. And there are issues in Central Europe that are drawing attentions, and this is where the European phase comes from. So Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great, was the king of Prussia at this time, and he was an extremely successful king and monarch who was known for being extraordinarily good at military tactics. He had reformed the Prussian army and made them one of the most formidable fighting forces in all of Europe. There was no Germany at this time. The Prussians in northeastern Europe, in northeastern Germany, were one of the most formidable German states. There were different German states like Prussia, Hanover, Hesse, Saxony, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, these places. And of course, the other major German-like state in Central Europe at the time was Austria. Now, the Austrians were led by a woman at this time. Maria Theresa was her name. And she had already fought a war with Frederick and the Prussians a few years ago called the Silesian War, also known as the 9 Years' War because it lasted 9 years. The Europeans love their numbered wars. There's been a 30 Years' War, which I talked about last live stream lecture. There's an 80 Years' War. There was a 7 Years' War, like I'm talking about today. There's the 100 Years' War between England and France. There's all sorts of different numbered wars in European history. That's just how the Europeans like to do it. And of course, you have a 7 Years' War, which is actually technically 9 years. But you already have a 9 and 8 years war, so 7 years will do. And that's because in 1756, the Prussians attacked the Austrians, and this started yet another war. Now, the Prussians' main ally were the British. The French came to the aid of Maria Theresa in order to continue their fighting against the British, and the Russians had an alliance decided to try to curb the extent and the growth of Prussia and Frederick's aggressive territorial expansion. Basically, believing that Maria Theresa, partly because she was a woman, was a total joke, Frederick moved to seize as many lands in Germany as he possibly could and to undermine the authority and influence of Austria while increasing the influence and power of the Prussian state. Now, here's a spoiler alert. 100 years later, the Prussians are going to be the far more powerful uh, country, especially militarily, over the Austrians, and it's going to be the Prussians who unite Germany into one country, the German Empire, in 1871. But this starts the Prussians' dominance and hegemony over the German people, probably with Frederick the Great and his ability to outwit and outdo his opponents. But he's surrounded in this war. He's got the Austrians to the south, he's got the French to the west, the British are northwest and across the English Channel, so they're not on the continent. And to the east, he has the Russian Empire, which can mobilize huge amounts of forces. And so the fighting commences, and it actually goes very poorly for Frederick on the continent. So, 2 years after the ambush of Bradford's forces by the Huron Indians and the fighting between the different Indian tribes allied with the French, the Mohawk Indians, the American settlers, and the British and the French in Canada, and now the Midwestern part of the United States, the Europeans enter their conflagration and the war officially starts, with Frederick trying to do everything he can to take land from Maria Theresa, and Maria relying on the French and the Russians, also led by a woman, Tsarina Alexandra I, and the French, led by King Louis XV, the son of Louis XIV, which Louisiana is named after, to do everything they can to undermine Frederick. So the French, the Austrians, and the Russians are doing everything they can against the Prussians on the continent, and the British are helping them. This leads, of course, to increased naval warfare, and the British once again show their naval might throughout the conflict, especially against the French. Now, the naval conflict and fighting is going to bring yet another continent involved. So far, we have two continents involved, many different nations, and different growing empires. The Prussians are a growing kingdom. The Austrians have an empire. The Habsburgs, as they are known. The French have a growing empire. The British have a growing empire. Both of them very active in the New World in North America. Obviously, the Spanish are kind of involved, but not as much. But the Portuguese also have a mercantile empire that they've built by also having a very superior navy in the Indian Ocean and around the coasts of Africa. And there have been different forts built up by the different kingdoms who have gone to Africa, the British, the French, the Portuguese, who have traded in slaves. And these fetorias, as they are called, are on the coast where basically goods are traded and people are traded to the Europeans that are then brought back to the New World to work on the plantations and in mines and in other places. So you have the French and the British and the Portuguese having these fetorias where they get slaves and take them back to the New World, and those become a battlefield as well. You have naval battles commencing off the coast of Africa between the French, the British, and the Portuguese, and the French are attacking Portuguese forts on the coast, trying to undermine their trade with Africa. Now, Portugal does have a colony in the New World, by the way, in South America, Brazil, and most of the slaves brought to the New World are actually brought by the Brazilians and the Spanish, not by the English and the French. However, they're all interested in bringing slaves back to their New World colonies, so they're all fighting each other at this time. And so now there is colonial fighting, there is naval fighting, and there is coastal fighting off the coast of Africa. So yet another continent is involved, and this is the African phase of the war, which usually involves naval fighting and naval conquest between the different sides. So you've got the French, you've got the British, you've got the Portuguese, you have the Africans, and this doesn't just involve the African forts and coasts. It involves the African kingdoms and areas who are allied with the different groups. An example of this has been the Congolese, Kongo, by the way, are tightly allied with the Portuguese, so they're going to help Portugal. Um, and they are going to do it, and Portugal is going to do everything it can to undermine the French and help the British because they have that long-term alliance. So there's fighting on the continent, there's fighting in America, and there's fighting off the coast of Africa. So you have three phases of the war. You have three continents involved. Now a fourth continent is going to get involved, and that leads to the final phase of the war. So four of the seven continents, one of them wasn't even discovered, and one of them really doesn't count, are involved. South America and Australia, for the most part, are going to sit this one out. The English haven't started sending prisoners to Australia. They'll start doing that in the 1770s. And the South Americans are obviously controlled by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who are fighting in Africa. So the fourth continent is Asia. and Asia involves India, South Asia. So South Asia, so India has been controlled by the Mughal Empire since the beginning of the 1500s, and they were once very mighty and powerful, but have been losing power as different Indian revolutionary groups have subverted them, and different Indian rajas have picked them off one by one and basically established their own separate principalities that only pay lip service to the Indian emperor, the Mughal emperor. So the Mughal Empire is in decline, like most empires tend to do, and the Europeans are in the ascent. And for a while, both the English and the French and the Dutch have been trying to control as much of India as possible, usually through trade. Now, it was the Portuguese who, in the late 1400s and early 1500s, went to India and established trading ports there, and established a trading empire there, and settled places like Goa and regions like that. Yet the Dutch had eventually taken over several of these lands, and eventually the English had come and kicked out the Dutch. And the French had taken over several port cities and coastal areas, just like in Africa, and were fighting the British over control of these regions. So you had the British and the French, so you had the Dutch and the Portuguese, and then you had the British and the French. There are different Indian Rajas who are trying to gain as much power as they possibly can, and usually the Europeans pit these Rajas against each other to increase their own influence and power. And the British tend to be very good at this, having rival Rajas deplete India's resources and manpower so that they can exude more and more influence and more powerful. And yes, Port Royal is an example of that. Um, so the English and the French are fighting in India, and basically they have their rival factions. Once again, the French have Indians, South Indians, who are on their side fighting them in different ways, while the British have other Indians who are fighting with them. And the British East India Company, which controls England's colonies, has already built a military pres. It controls England's colonies in India, has already built a military presence in India, and isn't going to give up its land that freely. So you have the British and the French extending their war into India. You have the native Indians fighting both for and against the Europeans. And you have fighting in Africa off the coast between the Portuguese, the British, and the French. Then you also have the fighting in North America, in Canada, and the United States between the British, the French, and their Native American allies. See, you notice the involvement of the Aboriginal peoples as secondary helps. I'll get into that more. And then you have the fighting on the continent between Frederick the Great and the British against the French, the Russians, and the Austrians under Maria Theresa. So, um, the truth of the so um, you can see the historical developments here, and you can see the patterns developing. And if you're enjoying what I'm talking about and enjoy learning about the history of the 7 Years' War, then you are in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing. Becoming a friendly neighborhood historian is as easy as that. As I take a breath and a drink of water. Anyways, moving forward. Um, and yes, the Portuguese did own a lot of slaves. In fact, they're the ones that started the African slave trade. So you've got the British and the French, and they're doing the bulk of the fighting. If you haven't noticed so far, however, this fighting also takes place on the European continent as the British and the French are sparring, and you also have the French sending forces to fight against the Prussians. Now, Frederick the Great is an extremely good military commander. He is extremely good at drilling tactics. And the way that Europeans typically fight in the 18th century, in this very supposedly regal time, is they march up to each other and try to intimidate each other. They lower their muskets in an open field against each other, one side facing another side who's doing the exact same thing. And they shoot into each other until their lines collapse. And then they charge at each other and stab their enemies to death with bayonets. This is a very, very ineffective way of preserving life. There's not much hiding. There's not much guerrilla warfare tactics. There's not much sniping. It's just walk up, point your gun at the opposing side, and fire. Then reload and keep firing. And back then, it took a long while to reload guns. You had gunpowder sticks and things like that. You had musket balls, so you didn't have bullets, but you had musket balls that would ignite and shoot out when the gunpowder ignited. And so and those would go into somebody and be almost fatal because they didn't have modern medicine and ways of healing people. So you could get really badly injured, and a lot of the times, if you got shot, it would lodge, it could break bones, you would lead broken bones in the legs or arms could sometimes lead to amputation because they were worried you would lose it would cause gangrene and an infection and you would die. Sometimes bullets would lodge in the body and doctors could not get it out without risking actually killing you. So the truth of the matter is you would have a bullet in your body for the rest of your life. And that happened quite frequently in many of these wars because this wasn't modern warfare and it didn't involve modern technology, therefore it did not involve modern medicine. So you had a lot of you had a lot of issues in a lot of different ways, and the warfare was not exactly safe or enjoyable, and a lot of people died, and basically needlessly, because you have once again soldiers marching up in a line, facing down their opponents, putting their rifles on their side, and taking aim with with very relatively compared to today inefficient guns and firing into the other side who would fire back at you, and whichever side broke first the other side would charge at them with bayonets and stab them. Now you would sometimes have cavalry come in like dragoons who would take out long sabiers called rapiers, rapiers, and they would charge after somebody else and they would charge in and they would shoot. They could either shoot pistols or they would small guns basically. um, they didn't call them pistols back then, or they would take out their sabers. And this is where we get the phrase saber rattling, because a lot of the time the cavalry would take out their sabers and they would move them up and down and try to intimidate the enemy before charging at them. And then they would cut them down. And oftentimes these horses got shot out from under them by those musket bullets. So you had George Washington had this happen to him during the French and Indian War. He had horses shot out from under him and he was injured several times. It's actually remarkable that George Washington survived either the French or Indian War or the American Revolution or to become the US president one day. So he's obviously coming of age in this, and he's one of the leading forces in the American side of the fighting. And he obviously was there at the very beginning of that war. And this experience in the French Indian War actually not only makes him an attractive partner to a potential wife, Martha Dandridge. If you want to learn more about her story and the first ladies, check out my Patreon, Friendly History. But also is what that amount of experience makes him the ample candidate that he becomes to become the leader of the American forces during the American Revolution. So George Washington is actually a product, as are several other American generals in the American Revolution, of the French and Indian War, which is the American phase of the 7 Years' War. Um, so uh, I'm glad you did that. So point being, you've got fighting all over. You have naval battles with very large ships called frigates, and basically lining up against each other broadside and firing cannons. And if you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean, you've seen this. It's basically firing cannons at each other to basically destroy as much of the ship as possible. And then you might grab onto a rope and swing across broadside and try to if you feel that you have damaged their ship enough and you've killed enough of their men through firing either cannons or muskets across from each other on the ships. You would swing across, land on their ship, take out a saber, a sword, or a knife, or a short pistol, and try to kill as many people as possible. So they would do this all the time in order to capture ships and things like that during these battles. So blowing up ships was possible. You would also have them firing guns and muskets across at each other in order to kill as many people on the other ship as possible so that they could overwhelm and take over that ship. Um, or put it out of commission. And if you can't do that, then just keep firing cannonballs. Once again, just a much larger, thicker, and heavier way of blowing up ships, as the musket balls would be used by muskets. You put it in, you load it with gunpowder, you set it on fire. The projectile explodes into either the enemy ship or into enemy persons or lands in the water. At the same time, you also had young children, boys, usually 9 or 10 years old. This is the youngest examples of people fighting in these wars, who were called gunpowder monkeys, and they would run the gunpowder and the cannonballs up and down the decks to try to get them on into the cannons as fast as possible. So this is the kind of naval warfare that was happening during this war as well. So this is considered regal. You've seen it glorified in wars, maybe like in battle in movies like The Patriot, or obviously in it's been depicted sometimes in Pirates of the Caribbean. But it was bloody, it was messy, and it was extremely ineffective compared to other forms of warfare that developed later on. And basically, anyone who got injured could lose an arm or a leg, and could also, and obviously you didn't have good odds of surviving your injuries because you didn't have the medicine possible. In fact, a lot of times the medicine that was used, they did have painkillers like morphine and stuff like that. Later on, opium became popular as they imported more, as they used that more and more in trade. during the 19th century in treating and numbing those who were wounded, as well as um, um, hashish. I'm trying to remember what it's. Hashish is one word for it. Uh, I'm forgetting the name. But anyways, and yes, they did not have antibiotics at that point. So people got injured, they got diseased, and they died all the time. And a lot of times soldiers would remain sedentary once they got injured because they didn't want them to move their wounded arms or legs, and that could lead them to developing pneumonia and dying. So um, well, that's trench feet is in World War II, which you call World War One. I'm describing the First World War. So if you're wondering why do I call the 7 Years' War the First World War, you should already see the examples. You have a mass amount of you have all the technologies of the time being utilized to fight cavalry warfare, um, naval warfare using frigates, and all the latest muskets and musket bullets and bayonets and things like that. And bayonets, by the way, in case you did not know, are long knife-like things that are attached to the front of a gun and they would either charge and use when they've broken down the lines of the enemy, and they would charge at them with these knives, or they would usually charge and stab people with their guns, literally. So very, very unpleasant, very brutal and awful ways to die. And many of these injuries that were sustained would take days to kill you. So it would be a very pleasant and horrifying way to die. So. Um, yeah, that's World War III, in my opinion. But yes, you are also right. And of course, they have horses, they have sabers, they have dragoons riding in with either short pistols or with sabers called rapiers that they would use to slash people as much as they could and to stab them. So there was a lot of horrifying ways to die during the First World War, during the 7 Years' War. And like any other world war, all of the technologies, as up to date as they were for that time period, were used to wound and disable their enemies. Now, in the American phase of the war, guerrilla tactics were more common because the Native Americans were more skilled at ambushes. In fact, the war started with the ambush on General Bradford by the Indians. And therefore, the natives would use different types of ambushing techniques, especially against the British and the Americans, because they were dealing with a much larger bulk of Indian forces, of native forces, because those natives were allied with the French. Warfare in India also, by the way, involved elephants. The Mughal Empire was still using elephants, and they would usually have gunners on top shooting at their enemies. So you had elephants who were prone to stampede and things like that were common in that kind of warfare between the British, the French, and the different competing Rajas on different sides. And you also, and back to North America, you had Native Americans doing ambush techniques. The Mohawk Indians, who were part of the Iroquois nation, who were fighting with the British, were known for their mohawks, for their head design, their hairdressing design, but also for being able to take tomahawks and throw them in usually semicircular motions and stick their enemies that way. And so these are all the different types of fighting that you would use. You had cultural technology and you had modern technology working together to be as effective as a killing system as it was. And it's ineffective by today's standards, but back then it was brutal, and thousands to tens of thousands of soldiers would die. Um, Usually they try to keep civilians out of harm's way. In fact, General Bradford's detachment was originally sent to preserve an area of land to reinforce a local fortress, but that didn't happen. The Comanche were in the Southwest, so they were dealing with the Spanish. The Spanish controlled the Southwest of California at this time. I'm not answering that many questions, but I appreciate everybody's contributions and what you're saying in the chat. I am watching it. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy learning about this type of history. Thank you for everyone for joining me on this Sunday afternoon to learn about the history of the French Indians 7 years/World War One. So you've got different continents, you have different areas, you have different technologies, you have different cultures interacting. And this is no different than the two world wars that you're used to learning about, in my opinion. Now, it doesn't involve China as much. It doesn't involve affairs in Asia and Southeast Asia. And both world wars obviously involve that a lot. And there was even fighting in Argentina during World War One of the war to end all wars. So on those stipulations, if you don't want to consider this a world war, I completely understand. But getting back to the war. So how does it end? What happens next? Well, let's go back to the European area of the war where the war started and the main progenitors of this war, just like the other two world wars. Um, the Germans, or the Prussians, one of the most aggressive factions in the war, are actually surprised and overwhelmed because the French and the Austrians and the Russians together Frederick is an amazing military commander. He's excellent at drilling and organizing his troops and creating really strong armies. And obviously, going over those military tactics that I just described, he's one of the experts at it. And the Germans and the Prussians have basically perfected this. Despite Frederick's amazing military prowess and talent, they aren't that good enough to overwhelm three different empires, which basically the French, Austrians, and Russians are at this point. And again, you've got the two female emperors which stick in his craw, Maria Theresa and the Tsarina Elizabeth, the daughter of Elizabeth Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great in Russia. And basically they are able to march on the Prussians and surround them by 1760, and it looks like Frederick is going to lose. He is getting ready to surrender when January 6th, aka Christmas Day in the Julian calendar, which the Russians use, occur, and the Tsarina dies of a stroke. And so Elizabeth, who had waged this very successful war, and by the way, is a very underrated Russian ruler, she didn't execute anyone, despite having many political enemies during her time. She set Russia up for economic and political success that would come with her successors, particularly Catherine the Great. And she also built more infrastructure and churches than any other Russian monarch. Yet she dies of a stroke on the Russian Christmas, which is the beginning of January, in 1762, and she is succeeded by her nephew, who is Peter of Holstein. Now, Holstein is in Germany, and Peter had grown up uh, worshiping Frederick the Great and the Prussians. He is in love with the Prussian military dress, he's in love with their military drilling styles, and he is really, really impressed with their tactics and discipline, and he thinks Frederick is the living end. So he makes peace with Frederick. He takes the pressure off of Frederick, and this allows Frederick to take the fight back to the Austrians and the French rather than be surrounded by the Russians. And this makes Frederick Peter so unpopular that his wife, along with her guardsmen lovers, actually overthrow him in a coup later that year and have him executed, saying that he died of hemorrhoids of all things. Interestingly enough, all in 1762, Russia was in absolute chaos, by the way, and that leads to his wife Catherine becoming Catherine the Great, who will make Russia extremely powerful in the late 18th century. So basically, at this time, Frederick loses one of his enemies. The French are drawn away to continue their fights with the British, and they're overextended. Their country is going bankrupt with all of Louis XV's wars. You have fighting in Europe, you have fighting off the coast, you have of Africa, you have fighting in North America, and you have fighting in India. And so this, may I say, World War is really stretching Louis XV and the French very thin. And yes, they have allies in India, and yes, they have Indian allies, but they don't have a colonial presence in North America, like I said earlier, that the English have, because they aren't willing to subjugate the natives the way the English are, and they aren't willing to push them out of their lands. So this has led them to have less of a firm hold on the lands in the middle of what is now the United States than the English do. And so because of this, the French um, are actually in retreat. And so things start to come to a head. The English are able to defeat the Indians and the Rajas that were aiding the French in India, the East India Company, as it's called. Frederick is able to bring Maria Theresa to defeat, basically. And by 1763, the war starts to wrap up. Maria Theresa surrenders. Frederick gains more land in Germany, gaining more influence and increasing the power of the Prussians, which will only continue in an upward spiral until Prussia assembles Germany into one country, the German Empire, in 1871, just over a century later. The British are able to defeat the French, and that leads to them being able to take the Ohio River Valley, which is now the American Midwest, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, states like that become British holdings and land for their colonials to start settling and traveling in. People like Daniel Boone will do this. The Appalachian Trail will begin to be carved up in the 1760s, and of course, the English allow the natives who lived in that land to stay there. It will be the Americans who seize this land after the American Revolution who will push the natives further west, basically dispossessing them in the Midwest of the United States. The French also lose large portions of their land in Canada, which will lead to Quebec becoming an English province, and the long-time standing French-Canadian presence in Quebec, which has led to Quebec separatist movements and the problem, and many Canadians and the Anglo-Canadians hating the French Canadians and vice versa. So Canada is divided but controlled by one country after this, as is the land in the center of what is now the United States. More and more of India is swallowed up by the British East India Company, which is controlled by the British Empire. The French are going to be in significant amounts of economic disarray that they will not recover from. And when they choose to help the Americans with the American Revolution, as I talked about in a live stream lecture about a month ago, this will lead them to more economic ruin, which under Louis XV's grandson, Louis XVI, which will cause the French Revolution. The Russians will basically lose nothing from the war. They dropped out of the war at the right time. If they had stayed in the war, Frederick probably would have lost, and who knows if the French would have been able to turn their attention and their efforts more to North America and defeat the British there. Um, but basically, the French Indian War and the Seven Years' War ends about the same time. England increases its influence in North America as well as India. The Russians lose nothing, and Catherine the Great comes out of it, so they end up the winners. And Frederick will continue to dominate politics in Germany until his death in 1786. Um, the Austrians will start to decline precipitously, and this will become only worse with Napoleon, who bullies them around in the early 1800s. And the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically a titular status in the center of Germany, will continue to lose influence and relevance because of the war. And eventually, Napoleon will, this product of the French Revolution, will completely deteriorate and dissolve them in 1805. So, and Liechtenstein was in existence at this time. It just basically did nothing because it's very, very small. So that is a short history of the war. And it included obviously the fighting in Africa. By the way, this will lead to a decrease in the influence of the Europeans over African political affairs and the slave trade, which will lead to the Europeans eventually getting rid of the slave trade and fighting against the Arab slave trade in the 19th century, particularly the French and the British. Um, Portugal and Spain are going to continue to decline, and eventually the Latin American countries in the early 1800s, copying the Americans, will throw off their yoke as the Spanish and the Portuguese will be embroiled in wars with Napoleon for their very existence. So you've got a lot going on. Europe is forever changed because of this. This is why Canada is owned by the British and not the French. And basically, the British are going to be the most affected by this because they are in economic ruin, as are the French. And usually the winners of a war pay more than the losers of a war, which is why the losers are usually charged with war indemnities afterwards, war debts. So the British turn their attention, and this is why the changes after this war are just as big as the changes after World War II and World War III. After this First World War, the British turned their attention to taxing their colonies. They're going to tax the Indians significantly. They will tax the native British people. By the way, this time England has taken over all of Scotland and Ireland and Wales, and has integrated all of the island of Britannia into it one country, Great Britain, and will do the same with Ireland in the early 1800s. So that's where Great Britain is and the UK is at this point. The United Kingdom isn't born for a little while after this. But basically, the British also have naval dominance and have proven their naval dominance, which will allow them to continue and explore and eventually settle areas like, of course, uh, Australia. And their naval dominance, which was verified in this war, where they were able to defeat the French on numerous occasions, will allow for more seafaring exploration, such as James Cook, who will settle not only in Australia, but obviously the Sandwich Islands and Hawaii. So that this leads to more exploration and discovery. It leads to more international influence and control by the Europeans in places like India. And with the British taxing more in places like India and America, there's going to be reactions. There's going to be Indian revolts that will eventually culminate in the British taking over the colony single handedly from the British East India Company and absorbing it into their empire in 1858. The taxation on the Americans is not very much, but because the Americans who fought and died in this war feel that they are being taxed without representation, they will protest, boycott, and eventually have their own revolution in about 10 years' time. So the events of the American Revolution are in some way, shape, or form influenced by the British paying back their war debt from the French Indian slash 7 years slash First World War. So the Americans will eventually get a revolution. So you had four different continents. You had Africa, India, Europe, obviously, and North America. You had colonies and native peoples and Aboriginal peoples fighting in all of those areas. You had naval fighting. You had the most modern technology at the time, all of the military tactics, the aggressiveness of the Germans, which is involved in the Second and Third World War, obviously, the Russians dropping out early, which they did in World War One. And like I say, history rhymes a lot. It doesn't repeat, but it rhymes a lot. So and you have a 7 years war, which is basically how long World War II, or what I would call World War III, lasts. World War I was only 4 years. or World War II, I should say. And you have the map changing significantly because of this. You have the development of new political systems because of this. And you have the things that are directly caused or indirectly caused because of this, such as the British taking over India, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the dominance of Catherine, the rise of Catherine the Great. She wouldn't have taken power had Peter not dropped out of the fighting, which angered the Russian public and allowed them to accept Catherine basically murdering him and taking over the throne. And you also have the continual rise of Prussia, which will culminate in the formation of the modern German state, which will help cause the First World War or the Second World War, aka the Great War. Again, people don't call these world wars when they happen. They didn't call the First World War, what you call the First World War, World War One until there was a World War Two with Nazi Germany. So they don't call the 7 Years' War a world war. They don't call the French Indian War a world war, but they really should, and they should consider the whole 9 years. And something that happened in World War Three, or what you call World War Two, that is particularly significant to my argument here, is that despite the fact that that most of us think that World War II, I'll call it World War II for the sake of argument, started on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland, there are other earlier dates that make the war longer. Some believe the war starts as early as 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria, giving it a constant presence in Asia, which will lead to it invading China, which will lead to Japan's aggressiveness, which will be at the eastern front of the war. At the same time, some people say 1935, when Mussolini invaded Italy, or Mussolini of Italy invaded Ethiopia and overthrew Haile Selassie and used chemical weapons. That could be considered the beginning of the war because there was extensive fighting in North Africa during World War II. And of course, some people also suggest, as I do, that 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, when Japan officially invades China, is the real start of World War II, or in my case, World War III. So you have earlier dates suggested impossible. So 1754 could be the start of this First World War instead of 1756 when the 7 Years' War breaks out in the continent. The fighting in the European continent isn't just like for me with World War III or World War II for you, is predated by fighting in other areas. In this case, the fighting in North America between the Native Americans, and the French allies against the British and their Indian allies, the Native allies. So given all of the similarities and the commonalities, given the fact that you have multiple continents involved, given the fact that you have modern warfare involved, given all of that, I think there's a very strong case to be made that World War One is not in 1914. It actually starts in 1754 with the attack on Bradford's forces and the beginning of the French Indian War, which morphs into the 7 Years' War, which includes naval fighting in Africa and along the coast of Africa. You have fighting in India. You have fighting amongst the colonial groups that were being influenced by the Europeans, just like there was colonial fighting in Burma in World War III and in Africa between the German and French and British colonies in World War II. You have World War One. You have these colonial fightings in Canada, North America, and India as well. And so, and the only difference is you have more involvement because you have more technology, making it easier to involve more countries and more peoples in the next two world wars. You have obviously China and Japan fighting in those wars when they don't really participate in this one, and you have South American countries that are independent getting involved, especially in the Second World War, or the Great War, as it was first called. So again, these wars aren't called world wars when they start. It wasn't called the First World War. It was called the Great War. It was only after the Nazis that they turned into the Second World War, the First and Second World War. And then, of course, you also have the French Indian War, aka the 7 Years' War, aka, in my opinion, World War One. So I hope I've made a convincing argument about this. You have also one last thing. You have the world changing in a remarkable way because of this war. You have the development of the revolutions that will create the United States, the French Republic, the rise of Napoleon, which will cause a huge ripple effect leading to the Latin American independence, nationalism, liberalism, socialism, and all of the 19th century basically happening in Europe because of Napoleon, more or less. And you have the development of Russia under Catherine the Great because she comes to power in the wake of this war and her husband's mishandling of it. And you have Prussia continuing to rise in its influence. If Elizabeth had not died, and the Russians had crushed Frederick, then Germany may have been united by the Austrians instead, and you may not have had World War One, as you call it, actually happen because you wouldn't have had the aggressiveness of the Prussians who unified Germany in 1871. So a lot of history could have been potentially different. If the French had won, I don't want to say we'd all be speaking French as an American. Canada might have been controlled by the French. The American Revolution probably would not have happened because the British wouldn't have had to tax their colonies at that rate. And some of those colonies may have been co opted by the French. At the very least, the Midwest of the United States would have a much stronger tied to the French people because the French would have controlled Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, areas like this for a much longer period. And the treatment of the Native Americans probably would have been significantly better because the French only treated them for trade and for conversion, not for subjugation and enslavement, although that did happen from time to time. The African slave trade probably would have increased and continued um, because because of the because of the continual demands for slaves by the Portuguese and the Spanish, but who knows about European colonization of those areas? At the same time, India would have been colonized more by the French, who may have been nicer to them than the British had been. But basically, there might have been the French overtaxing these colonies and leading to revolutions in Canada and India, rather than just the British who did it to the Indians and to the Atlantic seaboard colonies, better known as the 13 colonies, aka the early United States. So the things would have been significantly different. Russia could have been Catherine the Great might have been just as impactful and powerful, but Russia might have become even more controlling of the continent had Elizabeth lived and the Prussians been defeated. Who knows? Who knows if the British would have kept fighting and Canada may still be British and the American Revolution may have still happened. We don't know, but history is full of counterfactuals and things that change. Um, all the time. Uh, History is full of counterfactuals and the possibility, oh, this could have happened and then that could have happened. We don't know necessarily. It just is we because history is contingent. It's full of different people making individual choices based on the context in which they lived. I'm just saying that, and so who knows how that would have changed. But the context would have significantly changed had the 7 Years' War, aka World War One, aka the French Indian War, been significantly different. Had and just like the other world wars, the consequences and the changes would have been huge had the other side won, which is just another proof that it is indeed a world war and not just any war that just happened in different parts of the world. So, anyways, I hope that that was a interesting argument, and even if you disagree, like Yusma disagrees, the truth of the matter is I appreciate you sharing your perspective and where you're coming from. And Yuzma, you just ignored everything I said because it happened off the coast of Africa. There was fighting in India and North America and Europe. So that's four continents. So that's not one continent, that is four. So, anyways, thank you for enjoying my perspective at least. And thank you for everybody for your comments in the chat. Um, I see some people bringing up Patton World War II, and I respect your knowledge as well. I saw you in the chat. You shared a lot of great stuff, and you are a G2. So we've got about 8 more minutes. Oh, Freshly, you just missed the lecture. We were just lecturing about World War One, possibly the First World War being the French Indian War. This is a topic that I've developed more and more over the years, and I'm very passionate about. I really get into. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you could see that passion. And even if you don't agree with me, I just hope you enjoy the content we are talking about. So please consider liking and subscribing. Um, I would love for you to have a podcast because I would watch it. Consider liking, subscribing, all of that good stuff. If you have any questions about history and social studies, and particularly about this war, stay on, and I'll stay on for the next few minutes and answer whatever queries you may have. But if not, like, subscribe, all of that good stuff, and then join us. Have a wonderful week, and join us on Friday for our live stream Q&A. Ask Me Anything, which will be Friday at 8, and then Saturday we continue at 7, and then 4 p.m. Sundays we'll have another topic to discuss with you guys. The Great War was the Civil War, Michael. Yes, well, for the Americans, but the Great War, you could call it the American Great War if you wanted to. That's a fair comment. Have you heard the use of Kipling's poem on 28 Years trailer? Made me go and listen to the full thing. Very powerful. Chris, I'll have to listen to it. Kipling was an extremely interesting guy. And somebody was asking about the Afghan Anglo War. I wrote my entire master's thesis on the Afghan British relations and the Russians in the 19th century. And believe it or not only do I believe that there are three world wars, I believe there are two Cold Wars. Obviously, the one that we all know, with the Americans and the Soviets, is the Second Cold War. The first Cold War is between the British and the Russians in the 19th century. So I'll have to do a live stream lecture about that and a video about that. And I'm going to have to do a video about this and why I think World War One actually happened in the 1750s. But yes, if you want to contact me, my email is friendly neighborhood history at gmail.com. So you can reach out to me there and we can have a back and forth there. I also have a Substack and Patreon and all of that stuff. You are Pashtun. Interesting. So the Pashtun are the ones who established Afghanistan. The modern state of Afghanistan did not exist until 1747, but Afghanistan has had some of the most powerful empires in history. Alexander went through there. Obviously, the Parthians were there. The Safavids were there. You also had the Timurid Empire of Tamerlane, the Mongol descendant, who controlled that area and actually defeated the Ottomans. Um, Yusma, that's a fascinating area of the world, and it has never been fully conquered by any empire, be it the Greeks, the Romans, the Russians, or even the Americans, dare I say, the American Empire. So, really fascinating people. But yes, it was actually Afghanistan was right in the crosshairs of the British and the Russians during their Cold War during the 1800s when they both tried to control as much of the land as they could in South Central Asia. So, my South Central is not LA South Central, it's South Central Asia in the 19th century. Um, But Kipling was one of those guys in writing The Man Who Would Be King who believed the Afghan people, just like the Indians, would be better off if they were indeed controlled by the British Empire. Um, yeah, they're definitely the Afghan people are a fascinating people. I love their history and their society, and I want to learn Afghan because I want to look at some of those documents because I couldn't use all of them for my master's thesis that I wanted because I couldn't translate all of them. Um, so they are an incredible people with an incredible history. And like many areas, like many people in those regions who are used to empires going through them, they respond to very strong leadership and power. And so strong leadership is going to win the day, which is why the US and all of its efforts at nation building and exporting democracy was absolutely full of it in the beginning of the 21st century. Um, did you know Freemasonry was established the same year as the United States? Millions pledge oath not to the Constitution but to secret societies. I imagine that President Kennedy probably talked about that. His ideas of removing the Fed probably got him in a little bit of trouble. Sabir, I know where you're coming from. I don't know that if the United States would. I don't believe that the United States would. It's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. I don't see it as a coincidence. Looking was critical, but interestingly, not necessarily about the war, but the way it was being conducted. Interesting, Chris. Yep, that sounds like he would do something. Like Kipling would make those observations. Also, somebody also mentioned, I think it was Mike, about Patton and the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Americans at the end of World War II. That would have caused World War III immediately, or in my case, World War IV. So, by the way, if you come onto the channel and you ask me if I think World War III is going to start, I'm going to answer by saying World War IV may start, referring to the chaos in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine. So, that's my perspective that we've had three world wars, and now you've learned exactly why I think that. Um, yeah, let me see. I'm just going through the chat trying to answer whatever questions I have. Yes, the French did come before the Portuguese did become before the French, but the Portuguese were still there, and they had always been allied with the British, so they were going to try to undermine the French any way they could. Yusma. Yep, the Balkans and the Caucasus. Well, that was an ongoing fight between the Turks and the Russians that lasted most of the 19th century and got worse as the Balkans became more and more independent and the Turks became weaker and weaker. If you actually ever look up a list of all the wars between the Ottomans and the Russians in just a couple 2.5 centuries, it's just mind blowing. And you could even include World War II in that, or as you call it, World War One, because they were fighting each other then, with the Ottomans fighting with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians against the British, French, and yes, the Russians. Um, yeah, I've heard that. I've heard the stories that there was a lot of giants and Nephilim, as they are called, in Afghanistan, and cryptids and things like that. And when you have a country full of mountains and terrain, you have folklore that's built up in those areas. So I'm not surprised. The Native Americans had many legends about this. And just like there's pyramids and tall towers and ziggurats throughout all of human societies, there are legends of giants and also mythical stories of floods and things like that. So these stories obviously hold some sort of power and meaning, as well as the buildings and megaliths and things like that. So, tutelage, behaviorization, War of 1812. USW skip. I don't know what you mean by that, but yes, that's actually a good topic. I could do the War of 1812 for my next live stream lecture. So thank you. Life is what you make of it. You've given me a topic idea. Um, yes, I've heard about these sightings, and maybe those are the origins, and some have some connection to Yeti and the abominable snowman, Bigfoot, things like that. Maybe there's another race of larger apes that are closer to Homo sapiens. Don't know. Um, let me see. Just going through the chat here. But yeah, we've gone about an hour. Usually we go about an hour. And my man, Alva Avu, great to see you. Caleb, I'm so glad you made it. I'm sorry you missed some of it. Caleb was asking, was Shakespeare gay? No. Might have had homosexual experiences, but definitely not gay. Otto von Bismarck is the Prussian chancellor the man of iron, who basically utilized the Prussians' military and industrial might to make them the powerhouse over Germany, increase his influence. He basically set up systems of economic and cultural cohabitation with the rest of the German states, which increased the power and prestige of the Prussians amongst the Germans, while leveling off the Austrian influence, and allowed the Prussians to become the German state by basically winning all the wars against Denmark, Holstein, taking over Schleswig, and then, of course, several wars against Austria. And it culminated with the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, where the first Treaty of Versailles, 48, almost 50 years before the one at the end of World War II, or as you call it, World War I, into that war. Basically, at that treaty in 1871 at Versailles, the German Empire was established. And the French Empire of Napoleon III, Bonaparte's nephew, was demolished. Yeah, it's very, very rare, Guns of Magnolia, to die of hemorrhoids, which is why Catherine, who, if you're right about that Yusma, that's very interesting if she did that. Catherine had very had many lovers and many ways, and it was the Orlov brothers and Gregory, who was her closest associate, who basically did the dirty deed for her and made sure that Peter was never seen again. Yeah, they did have their own fights. I don't know if they were fighting at this time. If they were, then now you have the Middle East involved. And if it's true that the Ottomans and the Russians were fighting during the 1750s and 60s, you have them involved in the war in some way, shape, or form. And now you have another leg in the war. So, Yusma, that only would back up my notion that this is indeed a world war. Yusma, it is true. They turned their attention to India, Australia, basically building their empire all over the world. And of course, they still had Canada. I'm looking through the chat here. Okay. Caleb, why do you have a piece of paper on you? Did you get cut? Yeah, I'm tending to a wound here. The Habsburgs are more German. In fact, they are the royal family of Austria, or were at that time. And Cannibal Rick, if you're still here, I am not. But thank you for assuming my gender. It always makes me feel good. Let me see. Going through the chat, just trying to catch up and everything. Yeah, Cal, if you wanted to learn about naval warfare, I talked a lot about it, so thank you for joining us. And yes, Paulad, I answered that. BH Queen, it's great to see you. I hope you're still here. Where is the ocean that the Titanic sunk? It was the Atlantic. I think it was on its way from Liverpool to New York. Let me see here, just going through the chat. Hugh Hefner from Timu. Yeah, I'll take that. But I do have a smoking jacket, and that's what I'm happy about. Sonia was asking, do you think service sector will see a lot of growth compared to manufacturing? Well, any developed nation sees the service sector and service industry increase. So the United States may be there. We'll see. But there might be a revamp, especially with the new tariffs that just went into effect yesterday, of the manufacturing industry, because in order to level off the costs that will come with tariffs, the domestic manufacturing industry has to kick it into high gear. So if the domestic manufacturing industry of the United States is going to recover, it has to recover now in order to level off the prices that will rise because of the tariffs put in by the Trump administration. That's how you counterbalance tariffs. You maximize domestic production. So let's see here. And yes, Ross, thank you so much. Kelly, why didn't the Republic, Kelly, if you're still here, I hope you're still here. Why didn't the Republic, she was asking, why didn't the Republic of Texas last? And by the way, I finished my live stream lecture on the French Indian 7 years, World War I. war, but I'm basically just answering questions I've seen in the chat. The Republic of Texas didn't last because they were just waiting for the Americans to accept them, and the Americans weren't ready to accept them until 1845 with John Tyler. The Italians switched sides in World War One as part of in the Great War, or World War Two, as I should say, because they weren't obligated to help the Austrians and the Germans unless it was more to unless they were attacked. So they switched sides because they thought the Allies, the Triple Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia had the better advantage in the war, and they were immediately attacked by the Austro-Hungarians. And they wanted land from the Austro-Hungarians along the coast of Dalmatia, which had originally been owned by the Roman Empire. So South African boys, the Italians, were getting back at the Austro-Hungarian Empire and trying to take more land from them during World War II. That's why. So just catching up with the chat here, guys. Did you read about the CIA and engineering of terrorist attacks by creating a Manchurian candidates for political reasons? Yes, they did do that, certainly. Um, Interesting, Yusma. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad you found this channel because I like what you're talking about. Let me see here. And then there's the Crimean Wars, where actually the smoking jacket I'm wearing comes from the Crimean War. Turkish tobacco was given to the British for helping the Turks defeat the Russians, and British officers would wear these jackets to keep their clothes from getting dirty with tobacco ash and smelly when they would smoke after dinner, usually. So interesting stuff. Vermont, yeah, vert, green, verdure, and Mont means mountain. So yes, Vermont means green mountain in French. And they originally had owned that land as part of their Canadian ownings until the British took it back from them. Yes, let me see here. So I think I've caught up on the chat. And yes, the world is in a lot of perpetual war state. In one area, if not one area, then another. And nobody talks about the war in Sudan, but there is a war in Sudan going on. And it's always about how war is conducted. Yep, that makes sense. Makes sense that they would use maps from that war. And that's true. That's where life is what you make of it. Victoria's interbreeding in that family has actually led to hemophilia, which is why Rasputin exists, which is why Russia was brought down by the revolution, at least in part. So, anyways, I'm kind of all over the place right now. I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us for this live stream lecture. We went a few minutes over to answer questions, but that's okay. I like doing that. If you want more of your questions answered and to talk about more topics you're interested in, join us Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern and then Saturdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. And it looks like next week we're talking about the War of 1812, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time live stream lecture. Be here or be square. Or actually, next weekend is really special because no, it's not. It's a regular weekend. It's a special weekend because it's me with you guys. But the weekend after that, 2 weeks from now, is our year anniversary. The Friendly Neighborhood History Channel has been around for a year. President's Day weekend is our birthday. It's Valentine's Day weekend as well. So I'll be doing videos about the history of St. Valentine's Day and the history of President's Day and the presidents that are celebrated. And so there's a lot of great stuff. And I'm glad you're a fan. I would love to collaborate as well. Shoot me an email and we'll talk more about that. Join the Substack, the Patreon, Yusma. I really like having you around. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone else for joining us. Join us next weekend. And yes, I will be doing a live stream lecture about the War of 1812, America's first real war after the American Revolution, Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And then the week after that, join us for a lot of fun as we do our year anniversary of the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Like and subscribe. Become the Friendly Neighborhood Historian just by doing that. It's really great to see all of you. I hope you have a wonderful week. Take care. Friday at 8 p.m. and for the next live stream Q&A. And remember, love history. Bye-bye now.